Welcome back. We have arrived at the final week of the Greek mythology class. I hope you all had a good weekend. This is July 25th, 2016, and today we have two videos, the first of which will discuss our final author for the course, Ovid, otherwise known as Publius Ovidius Naso. And then we will give the final lecture of the course, which will describe the transformation from the Roman Republic to the Roman Empire, and we'll also say a few words about what to take away from Roman mythology as it compares to Greek mythology, and in particular as Roman mythology, of course, picks up Greek mythology as a source for some of its own writings and mythic stories. So, without further ado, let me introduce you now to Ovid. The first thing I'm going to do, though, is to give you his date of death, which I did not do before. This date is actually rather important, not so much the number, but because of what actually happened to Ovid. Because Ovid had a rather bad end to his life. He thought it was undeserved. It's hard to tell. But Ovid died in a circumstances that I can quite assure you he would have infinitely preferred not to have died in. More on that coming up in a little bit. Please at this point pause your video and locate the final handout, which is handout number 5, which is in your resources section of Sakai, or on the schedule attached as a handout. Also, please open up the schedule link too, because it has the outline that you're going to need for Ovid, as well as for the second video today on the transformation from Roman Republic to Roman Empire. Please pause your video and take care of those two matters. Okay, are you all set? Please observe. It's Zeus's or Jupiter's lightning bolt. You probably thought you were going to get through the whole course without seeing it again. Nope, there's one more thing that you have to be careful not to be zapped about. It relates to metamorphoses, and when we come to talking about metamorphoses, I will reveal why Zeus's and Jupiter's lightning bolt has made an appearance once again. All right, let's begin, though, talking about Ovid. Ovid had a career that closely paralleled that of his contemporary Virgil. And it first appeared that Ovid was going to have a very successful life and career, just like Virgil's. Because, like Virgil, he was born on the country in the northern part of Italy. Like Virgil, he traveled extensively across Italy and across over to Greece. Like Virgil, he got a very broad education, maybe in some ways more so than Virgil, based on the number of myths that he was able to compile for Metamorphoses and his other works besides. Like Virgil, Ovid chose not to participate too much in politics and instead to devote most of his time to poetry. And like Virgil, Ovid wrote works that eventually came under scrutiny, but in the positive attention of Emperor Augustus. And of course, like Virgil, Ovid ended up being sponsored by one of Ovid's patrons. This time it was the other patron named Messala. But that's where the parallelism ends. Something went wrong somewhere along the way. Now, if you are aware of anything about Emperor Augustus, you may be aware also that he had a daughter named Julia. In fact, if you have watched the PBS series I, Claudius, you may remember what goes on with Julia. In fairness, Julia was, as the only daughter of Augustus, had the really unenviable responsibility of trying to carry on the Julian line for the Principate, the emperor position. And I suspect that that was too much for the poor girl to take on. But her response to that was definitely dubious. She ended up engaging in lots and lots of very promiscuous behavior with many, many different men. She actually married 3 times in her life, and none of the marriages was very successful. Probably if she'd been able to stay married to whom she wanted to be married to, that was her first husband, Marcellus, all might have worked out well, but unfortunately Marcellus died relatively young. Marcellus was actually Octavia's cousin, and it's hard to know how history might have worked itself differently if that marriage would have been able to stay intact. In all results, Julia ended up not being equal to the task of carrying on the Augustus legacy. Now, it could be that Julia was one of many people connected with Ovid, if Ovid had the kind of lifestyle that is suggested from his poetry. And so it's possible they got connected in a way that Father Augustus did not approve. So maybe that's an explanation for Ovid's unfortunate fate. In all events, but definitely by AD 8, when Metamorphoses was published, Ovid went into exile. He went off to the area near what is today the Crimea Peninsula. It's the northern part of the Black Sea, apparently very cold and stormy, and with people there who did not speak Latin. This was a terrible fate for Ovid. He died out there in exile. That's why I was pointing at the date, AD 17, because he actually lived about 9 years out there in really dreadful circumstances. He tried to write poetry and letters back home, including to his third wife, trying to get him, trying to get her to get him back home, or trying to get Augustus to repeal his exile, and nothing worked. And in the end, he ended up, in fact, dying, as we say, out in exile. That, however, was not before a really tremendous literary output of his. And in terms of what he accomplished as a writer and the legacy that he left for later writers, Ovid was practically unparalleled. Again, especially with Metamorphoses, but with the other works as well. So I'll just take you very quickly through the works. You really can find them on your handout and on the outline, so I won't take up too much time here. But the first work that Ovid wrote was called Amores, which was basically the difficulties that a poet has when he's in love with somebody who does not requite his love. So Ovid describes didactically how a particular poet goes about writing when he's in fact in love. Now I need to pause here and talk to you a little bit about the meter. You, of course, are now familiar with the dactylic hexameter meter because I've been describing it in connection with epic. But now we have something new. We have a meter that's called elegiac. And elegiac is very similar to the dactylic hexameter that you've already learned, but it has a slight variation in it. So dactylic hexameter, remember, does this. Now, elegiac meter will do the same thing, except that every other line, it changes it a little bit to this. So you can hear that. There's a beat left out. Now, elegiac meter almost feels like a dance kind of meter. And its name, however, suggests that originally in ancient Greece, it would have been used for funereal poetry. And in fact, we have the tradition from ancient Greece of the epigram, which was the short poem that was written up on a stele, like an inscription, on the tomb of somebody prominent who had died. And we have several poets in the ancient Greek world who wrote these very short pieces called the epigrams. And elegiac meter appears to have started off with that purpose, but then apparently got used for quite a few other purposes afterwards, including and especially love poetry. And so Ovid, together with two other poets named Tibullus and Propertius, became known as a triplet called the elegists. And they were the ones who were the most successful at bringing elegy into the Roman literature and being able to perfect the art of the creation of poetry with that particular meter, the elegiac meter. So the first work was Amores. Later on, he wrote Heroides, which was a series of letters written by female figures to basically tell off all of their male counterparts who had mistreated them. It's quite a remarkable work because it gives a really good, excellent voice to the female side of the various various myths, especially those women who had been mistreated in some way. So there's a Heroides letter by Dido against Aeneas, one by Ariadne against Theseus, one by Medea against Jason, one by Deianira against Hercules. Remember the woman who had all that blood from the centaur and put it on the cloak? That one. And so on. Also Phaedra, the one who took down Hippolytus, Theseus' son, a stepmother relationship. And also one by Penelope against Odysseus, I should mention as well. So those are the Heroides. These poems that are letters written by women to their negligent men. After that, we have the work that could have gotten Ovid into trouble, Ars Amatoria, the art of lovemaking, which is basically the art of how to commit adultery. If you are a man who wants a woman who is married, how do you go about getting her? And then the third book, if you are a woman who wants a man who is married, how do you go about getting him? That might have been morally too much for Augustus to deal with. However, it did take several more years for Ovid actually to go into exile, so it's hard to know if that was the work that did it. So then comes Metamorphoses, which is an epic work, 15 books describing various aspects of mythology that contribute toward creation and then to the evolution of time from creation all the way out to the creation of the Roman world and culminating in the current day Roman Empire. It's really a magnificent work for the compilation of myths that it produces. We'll come back and talk a little bit more about it later. We have Fasti, which is a series of poems written about each day in the calendar. And unfortunately, it only made it through 6 months before it was broken in the middle. Apparently, that's when Ovid went into exile, and so we never got to complete that work. So we only have January through June. But there's a lot of mythology contained about those days of the year from January to June. And then we have all the works that Ovid wrote out in exile, Tristia, which are laments, and then the Epistolae, which are the letters, ex Ponto, which means from the Black Sea. And as we know, they were not successful in springing Ovid from exile. So those are his basic works. And then he apparently also wrote a tragedy of Medea that is lost to us. We actually do have a tragedy of Medea written by another author named Seneca, which could possibly have been influenced by this work, but again, we do not have it surviving. So, the legacy that we do get from Ovid, despite his own very bitter legacy of having ended his life in exile, is the tremendous literary output plus all the erudition that Ovid managed to show. In particular with Metamorphoses, many of the myths that he describes to us very likely would never have survived to us otherwise. We have a whole compilation of Greek-based and Near Eastern-based myths that are combined in this really marvelous narrative of these 15 books in Metamorphoses. Unfortunately, your textbook obviously did not have room to publish all 15 books. It would have been rather awful for you to have to read that all in one weekend, I do realize. So only particularly notable stories are picked out, namely creation, and the story of Echo and Narcissus, the story of Apollo and Daphne, which shows Apollo running after Daphne like a hound, chasing after a rabbit. Not exactly a very edifying image of Apollo. And a little bit from the later part of the work, which describes the creation of Rome itself, starting with Aeneas, same way that Virgil does, and finally culminating in the death of Caesar and the accession of Augustus as emperor. Ovid ends the work a little bit strangely. He actually has a signature at the end, which is called in Greek a spragus, basically like a seal in concluding a work. There's a fairly established tradition of poets who write long works in sealing their works this way with a final comment about their own contribution. Well, what Ovid basically says is, I've written this wonderful work, and long after Rome dies, my reputation will last forever. I wonder if Augustus didn't like that. Something about exile? But in any event, Metamorphoses is marvelous. This is lightning bolt. When you're going to go describe the plot of Metamorphoses, if you get that as a passage on your final exam, 2 things that you must mention. It describes creation narratively out to the Roman Empire, and also that it describes transformations, which is what Metamorphoses refers to. So be sure when you describe the plot of Metamorphoses, don't get zapped by an omission. Make sure that you include both of those in your description of the plot of Metamorphoses if you get one of those passages as one of your 4 on your final exam. So Metamorphoses opens with creation in a very biblical-like way, and it also has 4 ages that mirror the 5 ages that you may remember showed up in Hesiod's Works and Days. We didn't actually talk about them back then, but if you have a chance to go back and look at Hesiod, you'll remember that Hesiod had 5 ages. They went gold, silver, bronze, heroic, and iron. And it was a very quick decline. Gold was fantastic, like the Garden of Eden. Silver was terrible, and you can see where it's going. Heroic is actually a little bump up. That included the Trojan War, people who fought bravely in wartime. And then finally, Hesiod's own age, the Iron Age, is pretty awful when families are fighting against families, and there's all sorts of civil unrest and other disastrous things going on that Hesiod is very unhappy about. So Ovid similarly has gold, silver, bronze, and iron, has a much more straightforward progression. And then he describes how, with the creation of humanity, things don't start out very well because we have Lycaon, a fellow who thinks that it would be really awesome to try to storm Mount Olympus. You may remember in the Bible the Tower of Babel. And Lycaon ends up, very appropriately by his name, turned into a wolf because he's ravenously hungry all the time. And lyc in Greek is the root for wolf, as you may observe in the word lycanthrope, which is the word for a werewolf, literally a wolf man. So, it doesn't start off too well. So Zeus, in biblical style, decides, I think we're going to get rid of humanity. I don't think this is working too well. And so he throws a flood down onto earth, and so everything is destroyed everywhere except for 2 people, an elderly couple, Deucalion and Pyrrha. They are the only ones who survive on top of a mountain. They cannot raise more children. So the question is, what should they do? So they go and visit an oracle, and they are told, throw in back of you as you leave with your heads veiled the bones of your mother. What? What do you mean that we're supposed to throw behind us the bones of our mother? That's sacrilegious. Oh, wait a minute, Deucalion realizes. Maybe bones of our mother refer to the bones of Mother Earth, the stones. And so they walk away and they throw stones in back of them, and Deucalion stones end up creating men, and Pyrrha stones end up creating women. And that is the way that the earth ends up repopulated after the flood. So there's stories after stories told this way. Most of the stories narrate some, as we said before, some kind of a transformation. There's also in your textbook Pyramus and Thisbe, the story with the mulberry tree that we talked about very early on in the course. And often the transformation is the result of either a punishment or something tragic. Although there are a few exceptions, like another elderly couple, Baucis and Philemon, who are treated very favorably because they hospitably received the gods Jupiter and Mercury into their home, even though they were very poor. The work eventually concludes with the Trojan War. Aeneas, his family, Romulus and Remus, the kings, like Numa. And it goes all the way down eventually to the death of Caesar. We see one final appearance of Venus, who is effectively the ancestor of this whole family because she was the mother of Aeneas. She begs to Jupiter one final time, what's going to happen here to poor Caesar? And Jupiter reassures Venus one final time, but Caesar will mount to Mount Olympus as a god. And in fact, many emperors in the imperial world did actually become deified. They became gods in their own right. And so with the loss of Caesar and his creation as a deity, and with the advent of his son who will surpass his father, the Roman state will survive. Yes, the republic that we've been used to for quite a few years will die out, but the new empire that comes in its place will far exceed the previous republic in splendor. And that, except for the seal of Ovid, that is the way that the work Metamorphoses concludes. So study it very carefully. You are definitely encouraged, if you have time, to read the rest of Metamorphoses on the Perseus database. It's really worth your time to read, and there are many, many wonderful stories. We are definitely blessed to have the work Metamorphoses here to preserve many of these myths for us. Okay, stay tuned. We have our final lecture today for July 25th about the transformation of republic into empire. Stay tuned.